Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have a pretty full room, a fuller room than I expected, so thank you for being here. As you already heard, I'm Christine DeVella. I'm the program manager for ArchivesSpace. And I'm excited to show you this functionality. Probably most of you don't know, but earlier in my career, I was the project manager for a program based in Philadelphia for the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections Libraries. It was a survey project to look at the unprocessed and underprocessed collections at 20 area institutions. And we were recording data about different kinds of characteristics about those collections. At the time that we were doing that, there wasn't a standard, we had a methodology that had been used lots of places, but there wasn't a standard way to record information in a central collections database. This was in the days before AT came out, and then in the very early days of Archivist Toolkit and Archon. So we used a FileMaker database. We needed to share that information across institutions. It was a little bit difficult. The information wasn't integrated with the archival description that people had done as well. So it's very exciting to me, both as someone for whom that was an earlier part of their career, as well as somebody who manages the ArchivesSpace program now, to have that functionality built into a collection management system that lots of people use. So I'll give a little bit of information, just context for what the assessment module in ArchivesSpace is, and then I'll do a demo of the functionality that's in there, different kinds of features that are in there. And then I'm happy to take questions about that, as well as I'd be very interested in your ideas. If you're already using this, or if you're thinking about using this, if there are things that you would like to see there that aren't there, or ways that you would like it to accommodate your workflow that it doesn't quite do right now. So in terms of what assessment is, just kind of defining what we're thinking about when we talk about assessment in ArchivesSpace and assessment in archives in general. It's often also called surveying. It's the process of evaluating, analyzing, recording information about different characteristics of archival materials. They could be, things related to preservation. They could be things related to the subject matter of the materials. Different ways to sort of provide a layer of analysis above the archival description that you're doing about the materials. It can be quantitative analysis, it can be qualitative analysis, it can be done for a single collection, or it can be done across, a range, a lot of archival materials in your institution, or like in the case of the project that I was doing in Philadelphia, across many institutions. It can be used as a way to identify further work you want to do with those materials. It could be a way to identify materials you want to pull out to put on an exhibit, things that you want to put together for a grant project. There's lots of different ways that the data that you do through assessment can be used. So why does this exist in ArchivesSpace? It may be very obvious, or it may be not so obvious. From my perspective, assessment and appraisal is, certainly a core function of what we do as archivists and other people who work with archival materials. It seems like kind of a lack to not have that in an archival information management system. As you know, ArchivesSpace came from the union of Archivist Toolkit and Archon. Those predecessor systems did each have an assessment, assessment feature. They were different in the two systems. What is in ArchivesSpace now is essentially based on what was in Archivist Toolkit. And that's primarily because community members that use that module, that use that methodology, really advocated for getting it into ArchivesSpace and kind of made it happen. And it wasn't really, a thing where only 1 or 2 people were using it, and so some kind of wacky thing went into ArchivesSpace. It was a widely used methodology. I think there's ways that that could be built on, and I'd certainly be interested in hearing what people think about that. So now what I'd like to do is go into a demo of this functionality and how it works in ArchivesSpace. Some of the things I'm going to be showing is how to create an assessment record, how to link an assessment record from your archival description, how to create reports of the of assessments, as well as some ways you can customize your assessments within ArchivesSpace. So some of the simplest things to do here, let's pull up a blank assessment record. You can do this under the Create menu, along with the lots of other things that you can create in ArchivesSpace. An assessment record can't free float out there on its own. I mean, it doesn't make sense that you would have an assessment record that isn't related to anything, but definitely you cannot create an assessment record in ArchivesSpace without linking it to something. The things that it can be linked to are an accession record, a resource record, an archival object, or a digital object. So there's lots of different things that you can do assessments on in ArchivesSpace. And you can also sort of, you don't have to just link one assessment to one record. You can bring a lot of different things into the same assessment record. But for the purposes of this, we'll just do a very simple one-to-one. Okay, so I have a resource record here that I've linked to this. And if I tried to save this record without linking to anything, that would be one of the things where it tells me, no, I can't do that. So let's look at kind of the body of the assessment record, what's here. So one of the things you can record in an assessment record is what is the existing description, what kinds of tools are already there to describe this resource in this case. There's a sort of a set of things here. You could, if you have different categories or if you call these things different things, you can customize this a little bit. So you can check off the things that you have about this record, this resource. You might have a lot. You might be doing an assessment of something that is fully processed and very well known in your institution and to researchers, and so has like a lot of different description already there. Or you can do an assessment of something that is really like just came into your repository or has been languishing in your stacks for a long time. So that's why there's sort of a range of tools here mentioned. For everything pretty much in an assessment record, you can both sort of check things off or provide a numerical value for them, as well as provide a note for them to sort of describe in a more narrative way what it means that you've checked those things off or given it a certain number. As with many things in ArchivesSpace, there's very, very little that's needed to make a valid record. There's very little that's needed to make a valid assessment record. The two things you do need is you need to say who it was surveyed by or assessed by and when that happened. Those two things, plus the link to what is being assessed, those make a valid assessment record. Now, of course, if I just had those two pieces of data, it wouldn't be, a very useful record, but you can decide how much or how little you want to include in an assessment record. There are some things down here to sort of measure productivity, if you're doing a wider, bigger project, or if you're just trying to get a sense of, how much time you're spending on doing this function. So you can record how long it took you to record a survey, as well as there might be times that you're only looking at a very specific part of an accession, or you're only looking at a very specific part of a resource, but you don't want to necessarily record the assessment on the archival object. So there's places here to record that kind of information. You can also, if you have a workflow, say, where you have a certain set of people working on doing these assessments, the sort of the initial assessment, but then you have another person in the institution, or another group type of people in the institution that review the records. You can indicate that here. You can also link, not just that a review is required, but who specifically needs to do the review, who needs to complete it. Again, there's a lot of different places here where you can record narrative information. To explain that a little bit more. Some of these things, kind of, as Anna was describing this morning in what she was saying about appraisal, there's some places where you might record this information in the assessment record, or you might want to include it in the accession record instead, or the resource record instead. There's a lot of flexibility in ArchivesSpace, of course, and you can decide where it's most useful to you to record different types of information. But one of the things you can record in an assessment record is just a very basic flag of whether there's certain things that you in your institution consider sensitive material, and sort of flag it that way. This area here for inactive is a way to say whether this is kind of the current assessment of this material, whether this is the record that should be picked up for the purposes of reports or not. One of the things about assessment is, of course, you may do it at different times. You may look at the same material over different times, and at one point, it may really be a certain way, and then after you process it, or after you've sort of reevaluated your collection policy, you may think of it a different way. So you may not necessarily want to delete those assessment records. You may want to capture, all these different things, all these different perspectives that people had over time, but you may only want to include the active, sort of current view of the materials, the current assessment of the materials in a report. So that's what this inactive checkbox is about. Then down here is really where you get into thinking about collections quantitatively and assigning certain quantitative values to different characteristics of the collection materials. What you see here are what's built in and are based very much actually on the methodology we used in the project that I was on originally. That was the one that was built into Archivist Toolkit that's used at a lot of different institutions. But I'll show you a little bit later that there's places to add other categories if these aren't the only things that you're looking for, if you're looking for different kinds of things. You can also rename any of these. As you may be aware, you can change labels in ArchivesSpace. You can change tooltips in ArchivesSpace. So if these measures are useful to you, but the description of them isn't useful to you, you can change that. You can customize that within your own ArchivesSpace. So for each of these, you can give a rating from 1 to 5. You can say what you want the rating to be, how you want to define the rating in the tooltips, or you can not use the rating at all. There might be some that you use or some that are useful for certain kinds of materials, but not other kinds of materials. You can give the numerical rating as well as add a note explaining what that rating is. Again, none of these things are required fields in ArchivesSpace. You use whichever are useful to you and ignore the ones that aren't useful to you. So the different kinds of things that can be rated built in to the assessment module are things about sort of the content of the materials, how rich of documentation is it, how, is it just like one scrap of paper that doesn't really say much, or is it kind of the body of an entire person's work there? Things like that. And that's obviously an extreme case, but that's some of the things you might be thinking about if you're thinking about documentation quality. Interest down here is another measure related to the content of the materials. Sort of thinking from a researcher perspective, maybe from perspective of what current trends are in research, or just in general, whether this is a enduring thing that people care about, evaluating that. Some other things are more related to the physical characteristics of the material, as well as kind of how it's been treated, either coming into your institution or since it's come into your institution. And then some things are related to intellectual access would be related to how it's described, how easy it is for people to find, things like that. Another part of the assessment record here is a place where you can kind of call out specific formats of materials. These might be useful, calling these out might be useful if you're thinking about doing a project, for all of your film, for example. You're looking for everywhere in your institution, in your collection holdings, where there's film. You want to call that out, and you're thinking about doing a project related to that. Or you're, very concerned about maybe your institution isn't a place that typically collects botanical specimens, but you know that you have a few, and you want to find those, and you want to figure out what to do with them. So this is an area where you can do that. This is another place where there's certain things built in here, but you can also add things in here if these aren't useful to you, or if there are other things that would be especially useful to you. In this area, in addition to the regular note, like just catch-all note that you can put in here, there's also places in here to kind of call out things that you think have special exhibit value, or you want to record something related to the monetary value. Monetary value in particular might be something that you typically record in an accession. You could certainly still do that, but that might be a useful thing to record here, as part of, if you're thinking about how valuable of a collection is this, that might be something you want to record here. Next up, and last up in the assessment record in ArchivesSpace is a place to call out specific conservation issues that might be of concern to you. Again, this might be because you're thinking about doing a project to identify certain kinds of things that need to be remedied, or because you want to know, where problems might lurk in your holdings, and you want to, eventually deal with them, or you just want to maybe isolate, certain types of materials, get them away from other things. This would be a place where you could call that out. So you can do this. You can create an assessment record, both as a brand new record and link it to materials, or if you are on an existing accession, resource, or digital object record. I don't believe you can do it. You can link an assessment, or you can, from an assessment, link to an archival object, but I think you might not be able to do it straight from if you're on an archival object. But let me just show you how, if you're on an accession, or if you're on a resource, how you would get to the assessment. So the toolbar there at the top of any accession record, resource record, or digital object record has a number of different functions you can do. One of the things you can do if you click the More button is create an assessment from there. That will pull you out to that blank assessment record. You'll already have the particular thing that you wanted to link to it filled in, and then you can go through the assessment record that I pointed out. Some other functionality. Well, I keep mentioning that you can customize certain things in an assessment record based on what's important to you as an institution. So let me show you where you do that. Under this gear menu, there's something called Manage Assessment Attributes. If you go under here, you'll see that this lists out certain parts of the record, what are the measures or what are the values that are possible in there. So it tells you what kinds of ratings are built in, but also gives you a place to add your own rating. So if, every time I do this demo, I put kind of dumb things. But if you wanted to, call something out like institutional value, like sometimes, say you work in a university archives, and certain things are incredibly important internally. That's the kind of thing that the provost's office is going to ask you about all the time. But really outside the institution, it doesn't really matter to you, or it doesn't really matter to kind of the wider set of researchers that you have that come in from outside the institution, you might want to record that, something like that, as another rating that's possible. So this is a place where you can do that. This is also a place where you can customize that list. Now you can't delete anything that's built in to the list. You can't delete it entirely from ArchivesSpace. Some of the things that like Dallas was talking about this morning about how you can change the way certain things look, you could certainly use a plugin to hide some of these things, but you can't delete them entirely from ArchivesSpace. But you can add other kinds of materials if there are things that come up all the time, or things that are particularly special from your perspective within your holdings. You can add those here. And then lastly, you can do the same thing with conservation issues. Again, there are certain built-in values that you can select from and that you could hide with a plugin if you don't want them to be there. But you can also add your own conservation issues that might be particularly important to you or particularly important to your preservation department. Once you've added something, you just save that. And that will now appear on the list, when you create a new assessment record. One thing with this, as you would imagine, it's kind of important that not just anybody within your institution can change these values here. So there are certain permissions associated with that. There's kind of a low level of permissions that's associated with creating the assessment record itself, but a higher level of permissions to actually add to the attributes. The last thing that I'll show you is that there are 2 reports that are specific to assessments. So if you go to the regular reports area, you'll see 2 reports here, 2 built-in reports here, I should say, that start out with assessment. And so those are 2 pretty broad reports that you can run based on the assessment records that you have in your ArchivesSpace. So these reports run exactly the same way that any other reports in ArchivesSpace run. So you go to the report list, you pick the report that you want from the list, and then you come to a screen that gives you a little bit of options for scoping it. There's not too many options for scoping it. And then you can say what format you want the report in. I'm going to pick PDF because it's kind of the easiest to see in a demo. So this assessment record report would be just all the assessment records that are in your ArchivesSpace. And if you only have, I think 2 is what I have in mind, so that report will run pretty quickly. Actually, I only have 1. So this would be the report. It gives you kind of all the information that's there in the assessment record itself. And then it also provides a little bit, just a really little bit, about the thing that you linked it to. The other report that's built in for assessments is the assessment rating report. And this is a place, the assessment rating report is a place where you could say one of those characteristics, one of those ratings, that you want to pull up something that has all the things that are rated at a certain level or higher, or at a certain level and lower. And I'll also pull up a PDF on this one. Some of these 2 reports, as you see, they're very basic. If you were doing like full assessment data analysis, you might want something more sophisticated, of course. So Dallas also talked this morning about making custom reports. Oh, I think it's this. This is something you might want to consider if you're doing if you're doing like serious assessment data analysis. You might want to also consider what some people do, which is connecting their ArchivesSpace database to an outside sort of data analysis system to write other kinds of reports. So that might be something you want to consider. But we can also talk about if there's other things that you think should be built into ArchivesSpace itself, because you're going to be using assessments a lot. Okay, so this is a case where I had one record that met the criteria for ratings, and that pulled that up in a report. The last thing I won't really show, but I will tell, is that sometimes if you're doing assessment work, people are sort of working somewhere where they're not working at an online ArchivesSpace, say. Or you have sort of a workflow where you kind of want certain people to collect the data in a certain way, but you don't want it to go straight into your ArchivesSpace. So there is import for CSV data, for CSV data for assessments that you can do also in the background job area. It's another type of import. Just as you can, import MARC XML records, or you can import EADs, you can import an assessment CSV. There is a template for the assessment CSV on our database and on our website, and also in the code. So if this is something you're interested in, I can certainly point that out to you. But so that's a great way if you have maybe student workers, or you have volunteers, or even your regular staff kind of working off-site that aren't necessarily in a place that has good Wi-Fi access, or you have kind of there's some cleanup or there's some scrutiny, you want to give the data before it goes into ArchivesSpace. That's a way you could do that. Or the other thing, might be if you've done a previous assessment project and you now want to take that data that you collected and add it to your ArchivesSpace records. This import would be a quicker way to do that rather than having to go record by record by record. Okay. So I think that's all I want to show you related to the assessment module. And I should just sort of shout out the people that I always shout out when I show the assessment module. So this, it was kind of a little bit of a time to get this going, but it was a true community effort. There were a number of members of the ArchivesSpace community that worked on writing the specification for this. There were staff members from Harvard, Historical Society of Pennsylvania, Tufts University, Smithsonian Institution, Smith College, like a number of different places that had either used this in Archivist Toolkit or were really interested in translating assessment information that they had into ArchivesSpace that they were planning to now use. Actually building the module was subsidized by Tufts University, and the two people that really worked on going back and forth with the developers and translating the specification in a thing that would actually work in the application were Adrian Pruitt and Dan Santamaria. And then the developers who actually built this and made it a thing in the application were the developers at Hudson Malanglo, who did a lot of the original development work on ArchivesSpace. So it's like one of these things that I get excited about when we have community members that want a thing and participate in making it a thing. So now it's available to everybody. So that's all I have to say. Happy to take any questions or have like a full-blown discussion of assessment. Yeah?
I was curious. I haven't found a way to customize any of the stuff about other than the preservation and conservation sections in assessments, but is there any way of doing that? Because that's the big hang up we've run into is they're at least in the front end.
So the question is about customizing the information assessment records. So are you talking about kind of the labels within assessment?
The top section where it has all these fields that are, accession report, appraisal and such.
Here.
Yeah, this data, there isn't any way to customize what's there.
You can definitely customize sort of what they're called. You can definitely
Okay.
customize that. You can't add, there's only those 3 sections that you can add new categories to,
Right.
but any of these can essentially be repurposed to be a different category. If
Okay.
if these aren't useful to you, or one or more of them aren't useful to you, they could easily be translated to the thing that you want. You can make those customized the same way you can customize any label in ArchivesSpace, which is to go into what's called the YAML files and type in the thing that you do want. And then when you start up ArchivesSpace again, that's on the server. But when it's started up again on the server, then that's what will appear here.
But it'll still be in the database using the,
Using the
so you
name.
have to be.
Yeah, I mean, this might be the kind of thing that might be something to submit to JIRA as a feature request, that this is an area you want to build out. And yeah, that can definitely be considered by the development prioritization team that Lydia leads, and Maggie, who's here as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, can you show me where the form is for the CSV?
For the CSV. So that's putting me on the spot because I actually had not looked at it this morning, but let me just see. And if somebody else has a question while I Google, please go ahead.
It's on the migration tools and data maps.
Oh, perfect. It's actually in an easy to find place. Okay. Thank you, Laura.
No problem.
So if you go onto our website, oh, I forgot I'm not actually hooked up to the internet. Let me pull this off for a second. So while I'm doing this, on our website, there's a migrations and data mappings page, and that has a lot of different things, including templates for like the digital object CSV and the accession CSV. Okay. Okay, so under the Using ArchivesSpace menu there's this page, Migration Tools and Data Mapping. There's a lot of different things here, including the tools for getting data in from Archivist Toolkit and Archon. But down towards the bottom, there's all kinds of things. So CSV to get accessions in, CSV to get digital objects in, but right here is the one related to assessments. So, and it does like flatten out, assessment record's pretty flat anyway, but it flattens it out. It gives you, the one thing you do have to do, of course, is the thing has to, you have to make sure that you have a record in ArchivesSpace for that thing and provide the number, the URI for it, so that it knows what to link to. But you could create a super basic record within ArchivesSpace for that thing and then link to it. Let me open that up. So this is an example here, but you can see it basically maps to what's in the assessment record. So if you have existing assessment data, I mean, it would be the same as any data migration work that you do. If you have an existing body of assessment data, you would need to map what you have. You know, you might have different kinds of fields, of course, or they might be called different names, of course. You need to map that to what the format is in the assessment template, and then you'd use that to get it into ArchivesSpace.
Right. would have to have an existing either accession or resource or, record.
Yep. This can't create that record for you. I mean, it will create the assessment record, but it won't create the accession record itself or the resource record itself. So definitely your process would be create that stub record first and then move over. Oh, and I guess our next, so I think that's all the time we have. The next session is here. But certainly if you have any questions about assessments, feel free to approach me at any point or any point, later on when you get back to your institution. So thank you.